Welcome to Unapologetically Sensitive, a place to find connection and a sense of belonging, where you can learn, relate, laugh, and maybe even live a bolder, brighter life. I'm your host, Patricia Young. This is a weekly podcast where we talk about sensitivity and the richness that it adds, the strengths we have because of our sensitivity, and some of the challenges it poses as well. The information in this podcast is not a substitute for help from a licensed mental health professional. Hey there, to the creatives, healers, sensitives, and deep thinkers. Today's episode is pretty amazing. My guest is Marielle Berg, and she is a psychotherapist, but she also has a podcast called It's Just a Cookie. It's one of her podcasts. Today we're talking about health at every size and intuitive eating, and some of the things that we talk about is what is fat-phobic language? What is body shaming? What is weight stigma? Instead of using the word overweight with health at every size, she talks about using the language of people in larger bodies, using the word fat instead of overweight, because that implies that there's a weight that we're supposed to be. And traditionally, body weight and size is viewed as being indicative of psychological and emotional health. But when we're looking at health at every size, that's just not the case. And 98% of people who lose weight gain it back again. But we have this belief that if we were just doing things right, we would be able to lose weight and keep it off. And the truth is, what she says is that if dieting worked, we'd be thin by now. She talks about how the 12-step programs, how it kind of fits in with health at every size. If you are someone who is adamant about liking the 12-step programs, then it's just something to take in as information. But I do want to give you a heads up. She doesn't demonize it, but when you look at things from a health at every size, it's a really different concept. And as we were talking, I kind of had some yes buts come up. And so I asked her about some of those things, and she did address them. There's something called Healthism, where we look at things as being healthy or not healthy, or some foods as being off limits, which ends up creating compensatory eating. I think we've all experienced that. We restrict a certain food, and then what do? All you do is think about that food, and it's a good food or a bad food. So we talk about that. Oftentimes in the therapy world, people will talk about if they have clients that are using food for emotional eating, that they infantilize the client by saying, they've got oral fixation or they're using food to meet their emotional needs. And she talks a little bit about this. There's also this belief that we're all meant to be thin, and that, according to Health at Every Size, is really not an adequate. It's just not true. One of the things that Marielle said when we hung up or stopped recording was, health at every size is also a social justice issue, that how people look at our bodies, talk about our bodies is just, it just shouldn't be the way it is. I don't even have words for it. So I think you're really going to enjoy this episode. There was so much to cover. I really wish that we could have covered more, and there are amazing resources in the show notes. If you're enjoying the show, please share it with other people. It's growing by leaps and bounds. I love the support that I'm getting from all the listeners. If you're open to rating and reviewing, if you have an iPhone or you use your computer to go to Apple iTunes, it does really help if I have more ratings and reviews. So if you're open to doing that, I would really appreciate it. And now, on to the show. Hey, Marielle, welcome.
Hi, Patricia.
I'm really glad to have you here today.
I'm looking forward to it.
Do you identify as a highly sensitive person?
It's so interesting. I've been reflecting on this in anticipation of our conversation today, and I only learned about the HSP kind of category or way of thinking about oneself more recently. So when and I haven't read Elaine Aron's book, I haven't really delved into it much, but taking some online quizzes, yes, I certainly do fit the categories. But throughout the years, and when I was younger, I found the Enneagram and the Myers-Briggs, if that's I can't remember exactly what the full name of that personality kind of test that's out there, and learned about introversion. So I found other ways of understanding myself, which I think have some overlap with being an HSP. So that's kind of a long answer.
Okay, that works for me. Can you tell me about your work with food and body image issues?
Well, I work as a psychotherapist in the San Francisco Bay Area, focusing primarily on DBT and couples therapy. And recently, I've pivoted my work a little bit to work more directly as a coach with folks struggling with eating disorders, disordered eating, and chronic dieting, and just general kind of body dissatisfaction. And I've made this change because I felt limited and frustrated, frankly, with the therapy world and dominant models for dealing with these issues, and wanted to feel more freedom in how I talk to people and how I guided people in healing from these various food and body image concerns.
Yeah, and we're going to get into this a little bit more, but I went to the doctor yesterday and I just recently learned, like, I don't have to get weighed. I usually turn around and ask them not to share how much I weigh because it just can trigger me. And I was reading on Instagram, like, you can tell them that you decline getting weighed if they fuss at you. And so I wasn't as assertive as I'd like to be, but I did say, can I not get weighed today? And she's like, sure. And I thought, okay, that was really easy.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think people often don't know that, and it can be so comforting for folks to learn that's perfectly fine to say, I don't want to get weighed. And if they need your weight for some reason, maybe you're going to be under anesthesia or for medication purposes, you can ask to be blind weighed, as you said, being turned around and not be told the weight. Because I have heard people tell me that they've asked for blind weight and then have had the doctor kind of tell them their weight anyway.
Yep, I've had that happen, and it's really frustrating.
Yes.
Yeah. So I want to just take a step back. Why don't you tell the listeners about your podcast and what it's about? And then I'm going to jump into my little story about how we connected.
So I have a podcast that's pretty new that's called It's Just a Cookie, which is connected to my online coaching practice that's newly formed. And this podcast deals specifically with health at every size and intuitive eating as frameworks for helping people heal from struggles with food and body image.
I love it. And we had connected and I thought I knew all about that. And so we had scheduled an interview, and the day that we were going to record, we got on and we just chatted before we started to record. And you're like, kind of what you're saying doesn't really fall in alignment with what the work that I do. And so you said, I don't think that this is really going to work for you. How was that for you, having to give me that information in the moment when we were really getting ready to record?
Well, I was disappointed, Patricia, because I was really looking forward to talking with you. So that was like the first one. I was like, oh, that's a bummer, because I think there's a way that, which is great in some ways, but also tricky in others, that terms like intuitive eating or health at every size are getting out there more. So people I think they're a bit of buzzwords, so people can sort of attach onto them without necessarily knowing really what they mean or diving into it. So it's not uncommon. So I was sort of bummed that we weren't going to have a conversation.
Mm-hmm. Was it hard for you to set a limit? Did you have any internal dialogue about what that was going to mean or how you thought I was going to feel, or was it pretty easy for you?
I mean, it was very clear in the moment that you weren't going to be a right fit, because it sounded like this was something that you were newer to learning about. And I think because I was also so very new with my podcast, it was a good learning experience to really learn more about my guests before I have them on, to make sure they align with these different philosophies and ways of thinking, because in many ways even though they're gaining more traction, they're pretty countercultural.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And the reason why I want to talk about this is I know that often as highly sensitive people, we can have a hard time setting limits. We think if we set limits that people are going to be angry with us. And I totally get that your listeners, and you need to have something that's a good fit for your listeners. And even though I have a history of an eating disorder, disordered eating, I spent time in a recovery home, I spent time in 12-step programs. It's been a very big part of my life. I didn't realize that it wasn't a good fit, but I totally supported you and like, hey, you got to do what you got to do. So it was really, what I want people to know is that we can set limits and other people can go like, yeah, it's great you're taking care of yourself.
Yeah, your response was so lovely. So it made it so much easier. Even if I was going to have some kind of emotional backlash about setting the limit, you were completely responsive, which was really wonderful. And I appreciate that.
Well, and I think let's talk a little bit about the emotional backlash. So my first question is, was there an emotional backlash?
I think what I felt afterwards is just recognizing or being reminded of how the issues that I'm really excited and passionate about are pretty new to a lot of folks. And so it's not uncommon for me to talk about health at every size and intuitive eating, and for people to really kind of be very confused. So it happens in my, in my everyday life with friends and family, with clients in my clinical community. So it wasn't a new thing. It was just like, oh yeah, I think the disappointment I had when I realized that it wasn't something that you had really sunk your teeth into is that I thought I had found a kindred spirit.
Mm-hmm.
So the folks I'm having on my podcast really feel like that, like, oh, they get it. And it's such a treat to talk to people who really understand it.
Sure. And I think as highly sensitive people, when we think we found our people and we find out that they're not, we have that sense of disappointment. So again, this is why I want to have the conversation. And as you found with your podcast, there are things that you don't know what you don't know until you bump up against something that doesn't work. And so now you have information about, well, maybe this is something that I need to do before I talk to guests that I don't know what their background is, that's really an okay thing, and that we pivot and we learn, and we can't know what we don't know.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And then the last thing that I want to say is, so then what came up for me is I started thinking like, I'm really curious about this. And then I thought, well, maybe I'll have you on as a guest so that I can learn about it. So I think that there are ways that when we bump up against what feels like a challenge or a loss or a frustration, when we get really curious, it really can end up working in our favor.
Yeah. And it spoke to me, Patricia, with, of course, not knowing you well, of what I read is your openness and non-reactivity and non-defensiveness, which are really admirable qualities.
Well, thanks. I mean, I think as podcasters, we know who our listeners are. We know what our content needs to be. And I'm very, very protective of my listeners. And there are certain things that I will tell guests that they can't speak about because I know that it's going to possibly trigger my listeners. Like I kind of feel like a mama bear, and it's my job to vet guests. And so I get, as a podcaster, you are going to have that same type of protection for your listeners.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move on to our next question. So how do you come to work from a Health at Every Size? It's also referred to as, is it called HAES or HAES?
HAES for short.
Okay. And intuitive eating perspectives.
Well, that's a long story. I have my own history of an eating disorder and then just plain old disordered eating and body dissatisfaction. And I stumbled upon, I'm trying to remember how I learned about it, and I actually can't remember. But there's Linda Bacon came out with a book called Health at Every Size, maybe 2008, 2007, I don't know, somewhere along there. And somehow I discovered it and read that, and then got my hands on everything I could that was out there that was along the lines of fat acceptance, health at every size, anti-dieting. And it really resonated for me. I felt like my eyes popped open and I was awake. And it's been a process. So it's not like I started learning and reading everything I could get my hands on, and all of a sudden I, changed my whole relationship to how I ate and to how I felt about my body. It's been an ongoing process, and it continues to be.
Sure. I hear you.
And then I stumbled upon, or I feel like I'd learned about intuitive eating also around that same time. And so the authors of the book, Intuitive Eating, who are Evelyn Tribole and Elise Reich. So Evelyn Tribole and Elise Reich, forgive me if I'm pronouncing those names incorrectly. They've been through, my understanding is that they've been through their own evolution in terms of how they understand weight and body size as it correlates to eating. So this is a long way of me saying that I learned about intuitive eating and read maybe the second edition of their book. And there's a lot of fat-phobic language in there. And I thought, this isn't really for me. This isn't jiving with what I learned with Health at Every Size. So I thought it wasn't applicable to my own struggles. And they have since evolved, and they have a new workbook, which is pretty much free of any of that kind of fat shaming or body shaming language. And they're also working on a 4th edition of their text, Intuitive Eating, where they're specifically trying to rid themselves or rid the book of any kind of language that is weight stigmatizing. And so the intuitive eating piece I've been integrating more recently.
So for people that are new, kind of like me, what would fat shaming language sound like?
Oh, there's so many examples. I think one of the things that came up in our interview, which is so common, Patricia. And I hear therapists say these kind of things all the time. So you had said something like, and I'm going to probably get the details a bit incorrectly, but something like, I was overweight as a child because of my relationship with my father, which I guess wasn't positive entirely. And I was speaking to a colleague not that long ago who said, the reason why I'm overweight is because of my trauma. So if we unpack those statements, there is so much unconscious bias towards larger body people. And I use the word fat for myself, so I'm going to use that word interchangeably with people in larger bodies. That's another way I'll refer to fat folks. There's an assumption that your body size is indicative not only of your physical health, but of your psychological and emotional health. And so if we're coupling fatness or people who are in larger bodies with trauma, with emotional neglect, with sexual abuse or sexual dysfunction, or a whole myriad of psychological struggles, that to me is really biased language.
Okay, so I have a question. I'm coming from a place of total curiosity, so I just want to be clear. What I'm thinking is the ACEs, the adverse childhood. What is it? Emotional experiences?
Yes. Something like that. I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, that they had linked, that Kaiser did a big study where people had lost weight and then they ended up gaining the weight back. And so then they devised the ACEs test and they found that people that had gained their weight back had scored high on the adverse childhood experiences scale. So, because I really want to understand. So help me understand this.
So upwards of 98% of people who intentionally try to lose weight gain it back. And this is not because of their childhood trauma or because they don't have enough self-control or self-esteem or whatever the kind of things that mental health professionals might ascribe, the personality traits or the childhood histories that a mental health professional might ascribe to someone who has been in a larger body, lost weight, and gained it back. It's not because of that. Weight comes back after intentional weight loss because of a whole myriad of things that are beyond our conscious control. And so this is a bit beyond the scope of this podcast. And I think for listeners who want to really understand this, I highly recommend Health at Every Size by Linda Bacon. There's also a less researched and maybe a less research rich and maybe more accessible book called Body Respect by Linda Bacon and Lucy Affamore. And so those books, and there's a whole bunch of other ones out there too, but those are the first ones that I would point folks to. Those books do a great job of really deconstructing a lot of the myths we have around body size and weight loss and whether or not it's actually attainable for the vast majority of folks. And what has also, with that small percentage of folks who can keep off weight after they've lost it intentionally, oftentimes what we find is that they're engaging in behaviors that we would diagnose as eating disordered in someone who wasn't previously in a larger body. So that might mean weighing and measuring everything they eat, counting every calorie, having to get a certain amount of steps in or exercise per day, a whole bunch of really chronic restrictive behaviors. And so these are not folks who are, and this would lead me into the intuitive eating, paying attention to their internal cues of hunger and satiety and listening to what their body is telling them in terms of how much it needs to move, what it needs to eat, and when it needs to eat.
I totally hear you. You know, I have a history of disordered eating. I lived in a recovery home for 9.5 months when I was in my 30s. I'm 56 now. The model then was 3 meals a day with nothing in between. My weight has been all over the place. And then a few years ago, I went and saw a nutritionist and totally changed my eating, lost 50 pounds, felt like I'd totally arrived. And what I found is it was just another way to externalize rules because I really like rules. Like, tell me what to do, give me something to stand behind. And so now my new rule was this was all under the guise of health. And the weight loss was not sustainable. And, you know, I'm back to trying to figure out how I can encourage myself to lovingly move my body and trying to figure out now where's that middle ground? And I just saw my doctor yesterday, and I have some health issues that are coming back with my lab work. I have this great integrative doctor. And I was saying, I'm really trying to figure out how to not, like, I hear you talking about these medical things and ways that I need to eat. And I'm really trying to figure out how to not get back into the rules, make some changes, but come from a place of choice and not because I have to and not because it's a rule.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think this, there's so much we could talk about here too, how it's very common for folks to think and to be told directly or indirectly by their doctors that if they're having any kind of health issue, that it's related to their body size, it's related to how they're eating, which is saying that essentially that you caused your health concern and only you can cure it. If you just have enough self-control or self-discipline, you can fix it. And I may be getting it wrong here, but I believe it's the CDC who they have the information on their website about where it says something like 25% of our health outcomes are related to lifestyle, the things that are in our control. And the rest, 75%, are things that are out of our control. We don't have control over the air we breathe. In many ways, we don't have control over socioeconomic stressors, over racism, homophobia, sexism, a whole myriad of things that impact our health. And I think that when people hear this, it can be really scary because there's so much that we actually don't have a say over in terms of our health.
Right. And when we talk about the fat phobia, and I'm going to ask you about this, but there's a graphic that's going around. If I remember, I'll post it on my Instagram page the day that this comes out. But there's a fellow in the doctor's office who is using health at every size terminology. He's fat. He's impaled by a piece of wood going through his torso. And the doctor says, like, just lose 10 pounds and you'll be fine, which I think is so representative of what I'm imagining is fat phobia, especially in the medical community.
Oh, that happens all the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Someone goes in with a sprained ankle, you need to lose weight.
Yep. And then what happens is, as a fat person, I end up thinking if I just lost weight, then my hip wouldn't be hurting or I wouldn't be having these issues. And it may or may not be true, but it's interesting. I have a friend who's just naturally very, very thin, and she's having all kinds of issues with her body. And so she's not getting those messages about weight. It's about something else. But I'm sure that if I went in with the same concerns that she's having, it would be all about my weight.
Yes. So people in larger bodies are getting different medical care than folks in smaller bodies. And right there, that's a way that weight stigma and fat phobia directly harms anyone in a bigger body.
And we don't know that. And so we just take it on, and then we purport that if we just lost some weight, and the message that we get from society is about control. If we just had more self-control and more discipline and we just followed this diet, then we'd have these beautiful, shiny, perfect lives. So can you speak to why that's so harmful and why the work that you're doing is really counter to that?
Well, I think it's so harmful because it's a pack of lies. There's a multi-billion-dollar diet industry. And if dieting worked, everyone would be thin by now. So what it does is it creates a regular flow of consumers because people don't blame the whole paradigm or the whole setup of dieting. And I'm using the word diet as a shorthand because often things have really morphed more recently. And what people will talk about is health instead of saying diets. I just want to be healthy, or this is a lifestyle change, or a cleanse or elimination diet, or all these kinds of things, which at their core are really often about wanting to lose weight. And one thing I say to people is that, if your lifestyle change was quote unquote good for your health, but it led to weight gain, would you still be doing it? And if the answer is no, that's a clue that what you're calling a lifestyle change or just something you're doing to support your health is actually really a diet. So just to circle back, I think the question was, why is it so harmful, or why is it harmful when we think that, I just want to eat healthy so I can feel better, but the intention really is to lose weight, or the message that we get from society is if we just had control, then we could
master our weight and we'd be happy.
Yeah, because it doesn't work. And I think we, especially little girls or people socialized as girls, this is a message we're fed from a very young age, that the way to find happiness and fulfillment and be loved and accepted and beautiful is by being thin. And if you don't have a very particular body shape and size, then all of that is not going to be attainable. And so this keeps us as constant consumers in the consuming books and plans and going to Weight Watchers. And I would even though it doesn't cost money, I would put 12 steps in there. I think OA is incredibly problematic in terms of how it deals with food and body image concerns.
Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So it's hard to know even where to begin, but so my guess is people go to OA for a whole bunch of different reasons. And one thing so OA is Overeaters Anonymous, which I've had my own experience in. And so Overeaters Anonymous really demonizes what they would call overeating or compulsive eating or binge eating or emotional eating. These are all terms that can mean similar things. And they identify that as, I think, an emotional and spiritual problem. And let me know, Patricia, if I'm getting this right. It's been many, many years since I've been to an OA meeting.
Well, you sound good so far.
Okay. And if someone is engaging in those kind of behaviors, what they might call emotional eating, binging, compulsive eating, what often gets missed is that much of the time, that kind of eating is compensatory. It's a reaction to restriction, which might actually be physical restriction, where the person is not getting enough food, period, or they're not allowing themselves to eat certain foods, or they're eating certain foods that they might deem off limits, but they're telling themselves, this is the last time. I'm just going to have pizza today, and then screw it, I'm never going to do this again, which leads people to then eat the whole pie or eat more than they feel comfortable with. So any kind of paradigm for healing or framework or 12-step program that doesn't bring in this very crucial piece, I think is really problematic.
I'm just kind of processing all your information. And what I'm imagining in my head is some of the listeners going, so you're telling me that if I'm eating healthy and that my hope is to lose weight, and you told me that I was going to gain weight, then what I'm doing isn't okay. And you're just telling me to be fat and I don't want to be fat. That's what I'm imagining.
Yeah, no one wants to be fat. Fat is like the messages we get about fat is, and even the word, just to backtrack, I'm eating healthy is really tricky. So we live in a world where there's a tremendous amount of healthism. So foods get categorized as healthy or not healthy, and it creates a real black and white kind of mentality around food. And it makes some foods off limits. And that is something that can really create this compensatory eating. And so within the tenets of intuitive eating, they do a great job of talking about how this happens. The minute you make a food, you put it on the unhealthy or the bad category, it's going to very quickly be a food that you are going to tend to feel out of control around.
Right. And you can probably quote this better than I can, but I remember seeing a study with kids and they offered them, I don't know, raisins, I don't know, a couple of things. Do you know which study I'm talking about?
No.
This is the gist of it. If you've seen it, I'm totally going to get this wrong, but the gist is there, where they offered kids freely, I don't know, just say raisins, apples, and I don't know, dried something. And the kids freely chose. And as soon as they told them that there was a limitation, that they could only have so much of something, guess what all the kids went towards? That, when we know that we can't have something, or there's scarcity, or there's limitation, or it's good or it's bad, what happens if I tell you not to think about pink elephants? What are you going to be thinking about?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So where do you want to go from here? I know I'm asking you all kinds of things and we're kind of all over the place. I did want to ask you about, can you talk a little bit about what body shaming and weight stigmatizing is, just since you said those, and I want to make sure we understand?
Well, weight stigma is any kind of message that someone receives that's either explicitly or implicitly communicating that their body size is less than is inherently unhealthy because it's larger.
Can you give a specific example?
A great example is something that we talked about a moment ago when someone goes to the doctor and they say their knee hurts. If they're in a thin body, they're going to get a whole bunch of treatment options to help with their knee pain. If they're in a bigger body, they're going to be told to lose weight. They're not actually going to get the health care they need. So that's one of the more troubling and damaging forms of weight stigma. I think weight stigma also happens just in terms of accessibility for people in larger bodies, where chairs don't fit, where it's hard to find clothes in a typical store, or a store might carry larger sizes or plus sizes, but only online. Or folks might have to pay more money for clothes that are in plus sizes. I don't know if I'm saying enough, Patricia, about weight stigma.
No, that's help. I just want people to understand, because we're so used to it that I don't even think that we are always aware that it's happening. And so I just want people to know, like, oh, that's weight stigma. I had no idea.
And in the therapy world, some common things I hear, I was just talking to a podcast guest recently on one of my podcasts about the term baby fat. And I've heard a therapist once describe one of their clients in a clinical consultation group that the client sort of had baby fat on them, that people in larger bodies can get infantilized and be assumed that they're sort of in, oral stages of development where it's just around need and intake. And this circles back to what I said earlier, which is how many therapists can ascribe psychological and emotional meaning to one's body size. And so what that does is it's relying on an assumption that we are all meant to be thin, which isn't true. There have always been fat people, and there will always be fat people. We come in a variety of shapes and sizes.
I'm just processing. You can keep talking.
Okay. I think I've also heard it when I've heard colleagues talk about clients who feel out of control around certain kinds of foods, candies or chocolate. A colleague was recently talking about that, and we were in a consultation group, and our consultant started advising my colleague to really direct this client to get in touch with her unmet needs. Like, what was the stand-in? Why was she overdoing it with these sweets or these chocolates? That there must be some emotional need there. With no recognition and no sort of acknowledgement, does this person allow herself to have sweets or chocolate on a regular basis? Is she getting enough food throughout the day? Is she trying to lose weight? Because if you are on any kind of diet or trying to lose weight or saying that sugar is off limits, again, it's going to go back to that whole idea of, don't think about elephants. That's all you're going to want. All of a sudden, those sweets or candies or chocolate are going to have so much more appeal. And as soon as you have some, it's going to trip off this kind of last supper eating, which the authors of intuitive eating talk about, where you feel like, oh, this is it. I already messed up, already had the chocolate. So today's clearly a cheat day or a bad day or whatever you might call it. And so I might as well get it all in now, because tomorrow I won't do it. And so none of that is often in the discussion when mental health providers are talking about people's struggles with food.
Okay, so let me ask you this. If I came to you as a client and my presenting issue is, and I'm going to use my words, like I'm overweight, I'm an emotional eater, my parents didn't meet my needs, I use food for comfort. What are the things that obviously you'd provide psychoeducation about the way that you work with people, and that's not your framework. But how would you end up working with me or with somebody like me that presents that way? Because I'm hearing what you're saying, but because my framework is so tied to some of those beliefs, I'm having a hard time thinking, so then what do you do?
Well, this was also part of the reason why I wanted to work with these issues outside of the therapy room, because I want to be more directive than I might be if a therapy client is coming to me. But to go with that example, I would do a very slow unpacking and a very slow, gentle challenging. And I would assess how open the person is to new ways of thinking. And some people are, some people aren't, or it might not be the right time for them. Even the term overweight is problematic because it's assuming that there's one weight which everyone should be, or which that person thinks they should be. So what they might consider overweight might actually be the weight that their body wants to be. And if someone is talking about using food for comfort, absolutely that happens. And I would really want to work on, I don't know if this is a word, but I was going to say undemonizing, taking some of the charge and the shame out of that. We do many things for comfort, and we eat for comfort all the time. If we have chicken soup when we're sick, that's for comfort. We don't think that that's pathological or that's because we have unmet emotional needs.
Well, it's because it's Jewish penicillin. Everybody knows that.
Everyone does that, yes. Now someone just needs to patent it. If we, have birthday cake for someone's birthday and we're celebrating together, or special foods around holidays, those are all emotional reasons for eating. So I do not want to live in a world where there isn't emotion connected to food, because it certainly is. It can create a problem when it's the only way someone has to soothe themselves. And if anyone has a history of dieting or trying to lose weight, or even if someone comes in and says I'm overweight, right there, that's a red flag to me that they probably are very uncomfortable with the size and shape of their body, and they probably have some history of trying to shrink their body. Right there, when they're under stress, it's going to make the appeal of food that much stronger, because it's something that they are trying to restrict and control, and it's the thing that is the problem. So one of the first tenets, or actually they call them principles of intuitive eating, is to ditch the diet mentality. And with that, you are legalizing all foods. So eventually, a piece of birthday cake will have as much charge as a salad, let's say. So, and the reason why I'm talking about this is that when someone talks about eating emotionally or eating to soothe emotional needs, I think about, okay, so if birthday cake is off limits and salad is what you're supposed to be eating because you feel like you're overweight and you should lose weight, when you have a hard day at work, that birthday cake is going to be so much more appealing because it's something that you have put a tremendous amount or attach a tremendous amount of meaning with. The birthday cake isn't neutral.
Okay.
Sometimes I've tried to think of different analogies. I don't know how well this one will work, but I think about, okay, what if we lived in a world where people who urinated, I'm going to say peed, people who peed more than 3 times a day were considered sick, or they were going to get sick. They have poor health. They were out of control. They lacked discipline. They clearly had unmet emotional needs. Maybe they had a trauma history, that there was all this psychological and physical meaning that we made out of someone who peed more than 3 times a day. Okay. So everyone is now trying to control their urine, holding it, and just going those 3 times a day. That's how you're a good person. That's how you're a responsible adult. That's how you are taking care of yourself. And then imagine that person, or any person, has a stressful day, or they have a fight with their significant other, or they get critical feedback at work. Imagine what's going to happen. All of a sudden, all that control and effort that they put into making sure they don't pee more than 3 times a day is probably going to be the first to go, because peeing is a natural body function that we need to do to keep our bodies working as it should. So they're probably going to pee whenever they feel like it. And then they're going to decide, I'm out of control with peeing. I clearly, I'm an emotional peer. I'm a compulsive peer, right? So I know this is a bit ridiculous, but it's a framework that might help listeners sort of understand how this can happen with food when it's something you're restraining and controlling and you have all this meaning attached to. Of course, when things get hard, you might go for food, because all of a sudden it's the thing that you can do to comfort yourself, because you're not allowing yourself to eat those foods otherwise.
That makes sense. And then all of a sudden you're totally preoccupied with, am I peeing? Am I not peeing? How much am I drinking? When am I going to go to the bathroom? How many times have I gone to the bathroom?
Yes, it's so consuming. Totally. And then all this meaning will be attached to, oh my God, I peed 3 times in the last 3 hours. I'm totally out of control. Okay, for the rest of the day, I'm just going to pee whenever I want to. Who cares? And tomorrow I'm going to get back on track and only pee 3 times a day.
And then that connection of, if I were only peeing 3 times a day, then I'd be happy. Then I'd have boyfriends. Then I'd be successful. Then it's an analogy. I love analogies. It's a good enough one. And I think that same thing, I don't think that same belief systems happens around being thin. If I were just thin, I'd have a boyfriend, I'd have a better job, I'd, have more friends. I'd go to the beach more, I'd go outdoors more. That we get all these messages about what it means to live in a body that's a smaller size. And if our body isn't that size, then many of us restrict what we do because we feel like we don't have a right to it, or our body isn't right. Or if we just lost weight, then we'd be happier, prettier, more successful, or whatever. And it's really a crock, but the messages that we get are so powerful and so subtle that I don't even think that we know that we're constantly being sold this bill of goods. It's not really a bill of goods.
Absolutely. And this isn't to discount that, and this circles back to weight stigma and fat phobia, that if you are in a larger body, there may be, a certain segment of the population that will not find you viable as a romantic partner. And that's because of their own internalized fat phobia and the assumptions they make about your attractiveness and your well-being. So that is true. It is harder to live in the world when you are in a bigger body. You may not get hired for your job.
Mm-hmm.
Random people shouting things at you on the street, which has happened to me.
Mm-hmm.
The oppression is real.
Yeah. It's interesting. I can't even remember the last time I experienced this, but I was invited to a brunch at somebody's house last week, and there were 50 women there. The woman who hosted it had caterers there that were making food for all of the guests. It was really lovely. And the friend that I went with was talking to this woman. And so I went to join my friend, and this woman totally ignored me. 100% ignored me. I'm like, okay, whatever. And later on, I passed this woman going up or down the stairs, and I'm convinced that she did a body check. The eyes went up and down over my body. And what I felt was, the body you were in is so not okay. And if I had that body, I would kill myself. The feeling was visceral. And I really, for the most part, I'm not really tuned into that kind of stuff, but I really felt like that's what I got. And I just had to know it's her projection. And so she obviously, provided that my interpretation was accurate, and I'm going to assume it was, that for her, how her body looks and body size is really crucial to her. And so it feels really important for her to make sure that she keeps that in check. And I was the check for her.
Right. So that your body size might be dangerous or catchy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Or disgusting or whatever. It's not my business, but I hadn't, this is not like, I go out all the time and I'm aware of this. It was just really unusual. And I felt really grateful that I was very clear, like, this has nothing to do with me. I'm like, okay, lady, you have whatever your beliefs are. I'm going to move on and have my day.
Yeah, right. And with that, I'm sorry that happened, but I'm glad you brought it up, because here we're talking about all the assumptions and we don't know exactly what's going on in her head, but if that was what was happening, the assumption she's making about who you are.
Yeah.
Not worthy, not interesting, not healthy, not whatever.
So can you tell me about some of your favorite or most useful concepts or ideas about intuitive eating, or maybe give us an idea of what intuitive eating is? Is this a good place to go? There's so much that we can talk about. So if you feel that something else warrants focusing on, I'm totally open.
No, we can absolutely go with intuitive eating. So as I said before, there's 10 principles. I really encourage people to check out intuitive eating, especially the workbook. The 4th edition will be coming out soon, the 4th edition of the text Intuitive Eating. So I don't remember all the 10 principles off the top of my head, but some things I love about intuitive eating, or that I've been thinking a lot about lately, are the ideas of permission and satisfaction. So especially for someone who's in a larger body, they likely won't feel that they have a lot of permission to enjoy food and feel satisfied by food. And that getting pleasure or satisfaction from food is a problem. That's what got them in this big body to begin with. that they don't have a right to enjoy food and have permission around it. So those are concepts that are often very new to people, whatever the size of their body. But to anyone who has any kind of dieting history, permission can feel really scary. Satisfaction can feel really scary. Pleasure in food can feel really scary.
Yeah. Yeah. And what I know, and I feel reluctant because like, oh, what if I say this and it's not right? Then just correct me. Like what I know is that it can look the same externally, but our motivation internally can be really different. So if it's lunchtime and I go like, okay, I'm going to have that salad because it has so many calories in it and it, has so little fat and blah, blah, blah. Or I can go, what do I really want right now? A salad sounds really satisfying. That's just what my body is craving. That the behavior can look the same from the outside, but the motivation for why we are choosing something can be very, very different. Is that in alignment with intuitive eating?
Absolutely. So intuitive eating so what you're describing there is making the decision with your head, which so many people do. How many calories does this have? Macronutrients? Does it have gluten? Does it have sugar? Is it good? Is it bad? Those are making decisions around food with your head versus making decisions around food with your body or your interoceptive awareness. And that means checking in and asking yourself questions. How hungry am I? What am I in the mood for? And of course, this, you can't do this at every meal. Sometimes we're rushed. Sometimes we don't have access to the foods we might be craving in the moment. But so it's not another diet that you have to do perfectly, but some things to be thinking about is your level of hunger, what might feel right in your body. So maybe it's a warm day and a crunchy cold salad is perfect, but maybe you're really hungry and you feel like you're coming down with something and you want something soothing or comforting, like, I don't know, a baked potato and baked chicken or something, whatever it might be. Maybe you want something that's more substantial or heavier. And so checking in with your body and figuring out what's going to feel satisfying and pleasurable and what feels right is a very different way of making decisions around what to eat, because it's not bringing in all that head stuff.
Right. And what I think is really common for many of us that are highly sensitive is, in order to survive, we had to disconnect with what was going on internally. And so we are very good at looking at externals for pretty much everything. And I know sometimes I'll get overwhelmed when I go to a restaurant or I want to externalize around like the price or the type of food and even with decisions. And so I often will ask myself, like, if there was no right or wrong, if I couldn't screw up, if I wasn't worried about the outcome financially, whatever it is, what is it that I'm really wanting? That's one of the ways it really helps me to kind of figure out what is it that I'm wanting internally, because I kind of like a lot of rules on the outside. That's how I survive, but it doesn't really serve me these days.
Yes. And for many people who really struggle with issues around food and body size, rules are kind of all they know. Mm-hmm. It can feel like that's that's how I stay in the safe lane. I follow these rules, and it's all about external stuff, and it's not checking in with yourself internally.
Right.
So intuitive eating is a process. So as I said earlier, I feel like it's a word that's gotten more traction, which is great. But just for folks who are listening, who are curious, it's not nearly as simple as, I just eat when I'm hungry, I eat what I want, I stop when I'm full. It's very nuanced. It's a process. It's something that we are actually all born learning how to do. And then, the world comes in and kind of screws it up and messes with it. So you can get back to that, but it takes some time. So I really encourage folks who are interested to delve into the materials, to maybe find someone who practices intuitive eating to help guide them, to listen to different podcasts that talk about it, that it will take some trial and error, and it's an ongoing process, and it's quite nuanced.
Yeah. What are some podcasts that you'd recommend?
So, when I first got into Health at Every Size, as I said, over 10 years ago, I don't think podcasts were even out then. And I didn't really do social media. And then, so I was very interested in these topics. And then I sort of put them aside and became interested in other things. And not that I let Health at Every Size go, but it wasn't in the top of my mind. And then in the last couple of years, I was like, I want to continue to learn more about this. This seems really important. And I put Health at Every Size into the search bar of my phone, podcast app, and a whole bunch of podcasts came up, and I was like, wow, like, the next generation, younger people are coming on board and talking about these things, which is amazing. And it's all over social media. So Food Psych is, I think, maybe the longest running, best well known, and I highly recommend it. The host is Christy Harrison. Dietitians Unplugged is fabulous. And those are the two that are coming to mind. There are more, but
how about yours?
Yes, thank you. Let's add mine, but mine is super new. So, but hopefully that will, that'll. I hope that my podcast will be added to the list of ones that people turn to. But Food Psych's been around for a long time, and so is Dietitians Unplugged. So those are great places to start for people to get more information.
Okay. Are there other resources that you would recommend? I have the books, and I'll put those in the show notes at unapologeticallysensitive.com. If you just go to the podcast page and then click on this episode, in the show notes, all the links or the resources that we're talking about will be there.
I would also recommend these folks out of Portland. I'm currently doing a body trust provider training with them. They're called Be Nourished. So you can find them at benourished.org, and they have online trainings and a whole bunch of different resources for folks who want to learn more about health at every size and intuitive eating.
While we've been talking, there's somebody I've been following on Instagram, and I don't know who she is, and I can't find it. But do you follow anybody on Instagram?
Patricia, I have been joined Instagram like 2 months ago. It is a whole new world to me. And yes, I am following people on Instagram.
Okay. I don't even want to try and pretend to say that I know who she is. So I'm just going to keep an eye out for her in my feed. But she's someone who's in a larger body that loves to take pictures of herself twirling. She did a lot of things in her bathing suit in the summer this morning. It's really been really nice for me to see, because I have really limited what I do based on how I feel about my body. And so it's really been encouraging and inspiring for me to see what other people are doing and going like, okay, I can do this. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. That you don't have to feel ashamed.
Yeah. And I have a lot of body shame, which it makes me feel sad. And how many times have I stood behind my kids in a picture, like, I'll show my head. What is that about? Or how many moms aren't in family pictures because we don't like how our bodies look? And for men too, I don't mean to not include the men, but how often do we avoid being in photos because we don't like how we are? I just saw something on Instagram, and it was someone who was in a little bit of a larger body, and it showed a picture of her standing and sitting. She's like, our bodies are supposed to, our stomachs are supposed to stick out when we sit down, and it's okay. And I will never let people take pictures of me sitting down. I make sure I put my elbow in front of my chest so I don't look so big. All of these things that I do because I don't like how I look in pictures, and it makes me feel sad.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is not because of your own individual psychopathology. This is a cultural, social issue. Women and anyone socialized as female from a young age is taught to constantly monitor their body. It's taught that any extra flesh or rolls or looseness is unattractive, is disgusting, makes them out of control and unlovable, all the things we've been talking about. So this is, we're essentially brainwashed from a young age, in addition to being taught, if you're a woman, that your worth is contingent on your appearance. And so that your body is a object to be consumed by others versus your body is something that helps you move in the world.
Yep. And it's not okay for anybody to make comments about our body, our weight. If we've gained weight, lost weight, like that's just nobody's business. And I have to say that when I saw the nutritionist and, my goal was to, quote, get healthy and to lose weight, and people were talking about my weight all the time, and I loved it. And then when I started to gain weight, it really helped me recognize, like, I don't think I really want to be talking about my weight either way with anybody. I'll take care of that. And if I feel a need to talk about it, I'll talk about it with who I need to, but it's really not open for public conversation.
And it's such a big piece of public conversation. So people, yes, when you regain weight, everyone is silent. When you lose weight, the social approval is massive. You look great. You look so healthy. You're taking care of yourself. It comes from every corner.
Yep.
And it feels really good.
Yep. There is this fine thing, and again, I'm like nervous that I'm going to say something wrong. So I'm really working on radical acceptance, whether I'm moving my body or not moving my body, really trying to not get into judgment. But I can see how I think that, like, my son and I have started going to the gym when he gets off work, and I realize that I start getting nervous anticipation during the day. Like, what if I don't go? And then that feeling of shame, and then I'm bad, and then I'm wrong. So really just being mindful and being curious about that. I totally lost what my train of thought was.
Well, I'll just say maybe it'll come back. So one of the principles of intuitive eating is what they call joyful movement. So they don't even use the word exercise because there's a way that's been tainted because it becomes coupled with weight loss and self-control and all the kind of stuff we've been talking about. So I love thinking about joyful movement. So what kind of movement is actually going to feel good in my body? Maybe it's going to the gym and getting on an elliptical or taking a spin class, but maybe it's a walk. Maybe it's some gentle stretching, and it's going to vary from day to day.
Yes, I totally agree. I know where I was heading with this. And so when I take time to move my body, I physically feel different. I feel like I'm taking care of myself, and it creates a sense of esteem. And it's not that I lose esteem if I'm not moving my body. And it just often feels different if I am. And so finding that way of just being mindful about, I feel like I'm kind of digging myself in a hole. Do you know where I'm heading? And can you say it more eloquently than I do? Or do I need to dig myself out of the hole?
I don't know if I can. I'll try, Patricia. Maybe part of what you're talking about is moving your relationship to exercise or movement, which I prefer to call it, away from that headspace or external, like this is good. It's good if I do it. It's good if I do it a certain amount, or I sweat a certain amount, or it's bad if I don't, to more internal cues. That if I can be aware of how the movement feels in my body and what feels right on any particular day, that feels better.
That works.
Sorry. I tried.
No, there's no need to apologize. It's a whole new way of thinking for me, and like a whole new way of conceptualizing. So as we've been talking, I've been having my internal part that's going, yes, but, and then being open. And so I just feel like I'm processing on all kinds of levels while we're talking.
Yes. And the yes, but is common. I've certainly had that when I first started learning about this. And I think almost everyone does, because it's a really deep unlearning of what we have been told for most of us our entire lives, and what we hear from the medical profession as well. So it's a process. There's going to be yes, buts.
Yeah. And to let that be okay.
Yeah, that's to be expected. Yeah. And the reason why I think people come to Health at Every Size and intuitive eating and really, quote unquote, drink the Kool-Aid is because they're suffering and they want a different way.
Yeah.
And that is really a path to freedom.
If people are listening and they want to work with somebody, and somebody says, I do intuitive eating or Health at Every Size, how can they be sure? Because like I thought that I knew what I was talking about, and boy, was I wrong. I mean, I don't do this for my work, so at least I wasn't creating that with possible clients. But what would you tell someone that's wanting to work with someone? What should they ask? How do they know?
Well, there's a certified intuitive eating directory, which I think can be found by Googling intuitiveeating.com or .org. So you can see if they're certified in intuitive eating. You can look at their materials on their website and see if they say anything about weight management or weight loss. They're not Health at Every Size. You can ask them what trainings they've taken, what books they've read, how they feel about weight loss. And, if someone, as I said, says that they do weight loss for whatever reason, that is not Health at Every Size. Health at Every Size is not against weight loss. It is weight neutral. So it will really be focusing on changing certain health-related behaviors, moving you towards, as we said, connecting with internal cues around hunger and fullness and movement. And whatever happens with your weight happens with your weight.
I love that. We need to wrap up, and I know we had so much more that we were going to talk about that we didn't get to. Is there any soundbite that you want to give before we wrap up?
Just to any listeners who might be struggling with these issues in their own life, and maybe this podcast has brought up a whole bunch of questions and the yes, but I encourage you to keep an open mind and let your desire to be free of preoccupation with what you're eating and self-hatred or self-judgment around your weight. Let that be a guide to help you learn about this alternative way of managing these issues.
I mean, this is something I've been working on for years, and I really can say that over the years, I've gotten much, much, much more freedom because I really have been trying. I don't use good food, bad food, and it definitely is a process. And there really is so much freedom. And at least for me, it's an ongoing process. And I still have more work to do, but I really feel encouraged by kind of this whole new movement.
Yeah, it's very encouraging. It offers a way out for so many people.
Yeah. Marielle, where can people find you? What are you offering? And then I'll put all this in the show notes also.
So I'll have a couple different places. So my therapy practice, if people are in the San Francisco Bay Area, is at www.bayareadbtcc.com. And I actually have two podcasts. So I have a podcast related to my DBT practice, which is called The Skillful Podcast. And then my coaching website is cookierevolution.org. And that podcast is called, or the podcast related or connected to the coaching is called It's Just a Cookie.
Perfect. And I will link to that in the show notes. Marielle, thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate it. And I wish we had 2 hours because we just scratched the surface of what we had planned to talk about. So just how it goes.
Likewise. Thank you so much, Patricia. I really enjoyed this.
All right. Thanks. Have a great day.
You too.
Hello again. So I'm kind of curious to know how that sat with you. My guess is that it probably ruffled some feathers. I know as I was talking to Marielle, I was thinking, so you just say it's okay for everybody to be fat and it's not okay to want to be healthy. And when Marielle talked about if we're doing something under the guise of health and we were told that if we did it, we would gain weight, would we do it? I kind of thought, I don't think so. And so I just have to sit with that discomfort. And I just really want to process this information and digest it. It's interesting. I do have the Linda Bacon's book, Health at Every Size, on. I bought it on Audible. I have a stack of things to get to, and that's one of the things that's on my list. So I think I'm going to try and make that more of a priority. Hope it resonated with you. I think it's an amazing topic. I really do think that, I'm sorry, guys, I can really only speak for women, but I do think that women's bodies do get objectified, and there's pressure for men also, but just this whole thing about, if we are in a certain size body, then we will be happy and successful. And it's not okay to be in a larger size body. I think those messages are just really prevalent and really strong, and they're harmful. I don't care who you are. Stepping off my soapbox now. If you're interested in working with me, you can jump over to my website at unapologeticallysensitive.com. I love helping people figure out what their strengths are. If you're struggling with relationships or overwhelm or trying to figure out how to manage better in life, I would love to help you out. Remember, sensitivity is nothing to apologize for. It's our superpower. Have a blessed day.